What's the most up story you've heard? Story 1. My barber for years, a Vietnamese American who gained refugee status during the boat people era, out of the blue while cutting my hair, told me a story about how pirates took one of her sisters as payment for the family's safe passage from Thailand to Hong Kong. They never found out what became of her, but the family never stopped looking. The story was told in what appeared to me to be the most nonchalant yet heartbreaking way, as if she was merely wondering out loud. This was some teen years ago. Every so often I find myself thinking about the scenario and the type of strength it must have taken to endure and survive such a situation. Story 2. Late 80s, early 90s in a small village in the northwest of England, we had a milkman shark groceries guy who'd been delivering in our area for years. Loads of lads, including my eldest brother, 10 years older than me at the time, had done milk round shifts with him, cash in hand now and then. They stopped doing it because he was a bit of a strange man, and my parents and other parents in the village were a bit concerned about his general demeanor. But you can't just vilify someone based on a bad vibe. Toward the end of his time at the local dairy, my two friends and I were playing football, using our front drive as a goalpost in our street. We were about 11 at the time. He pulled up and was doing his money collection round. My parents weren't home, but we were playing heads and volleys in front of my house. He said something along the lines of he was going back to the dairy, that my parents' house was the last stop, and asked if me and my two friends wanted a lift there and back on the back of the little electric milk float, a la Pat Mustard for any Father Ted fans. And being stupid kids, we said yes. We thought the dairy was around the corner, but it was about 25 minutes away through country lanes that we'd never been down before. We got to the dairy thinking he'd continue on his rounds and drop us off where he picked us up. Got there, to the dairy, and he said he'd clocked off for the day. He made us get in the back of his weird estate car with blankets in the back. It was really strange and quiet. We were quite scared. He dropped us off safe and sound right outside the house anyway. Our parents collectively went mental. I remember us all saying, "He's a weirdo, probably a predator," and being told off for throwing around accusations like that, although all our parents had a huge go at him anyway and told him never to do that again. My dad was furious, thought he was going to punch him. We never saw him again. A few years later, he was on the front page of all the local newspapers for raping and sexually abusing young boys dating back to the 70s. He went to prison for a very long time, probably dead now with a bit of luck. I drink Cravendale filtered nowadays. Story 3. Not my story, but I remember my mother telling me this. We lived in a small cul-de-sac back in 2012. I wasn't home at the time. Unfortunately, my brother was, though. But he didn't see anything. There was a woman who lived across from us, and her ex-husband had come over to the house and shot her. My stepdad had heard arguing and then gunshots. He said he opened the window and saw the man fleeing. My mother had called 911. My stepdad ran outside to see if the woman was okay, only to find her slumped over, dead in her home. He ended up having to testify in court about what he saw that day. It was really sad. The ex-husband took a mom away from her two kids, a father in prison and a mother who's gone. That situation has always stuck in my mind, even though I wasn't home that day. Edit. Another thing that happened as well, back in 2018, this man and his son moved into our condo complex next door to us after the man had recently separated from his wife. The son was about 17 or 18, I'd say. I didn't know the son very well, more like acquaintances. Occasionally in passing, we'd say hi to each other and go about our business. One day I found out the son had died by suicide. From what I heard, he had been tied up in some drug dealing and just messy drug issues. Apparently, he had a warrant out for his arrest, and the cops were looking for him. He drove to a Publix that was next to my complex, shot an off-duty officer who was grabbing lunch, and then turned the gun on himself. He died. The officer survived but was rushed to the hospital in critical condition. After that, I barely ever saw the father, and when I did, he looked so miserable and depressed. As a mom myself, I can't imagine losing my child in such a horrible way. Story 4. My grandmother told me about how her mother survived the Ustashi reign in Croatia. When she was 15, in 1935, a group of militiamen connected with the Ustashi just started shooting people in the Jewish neighborhood of the city she lived in. She and her younger sister, who had been walking home from school, ran off the road and into a forested area. A man with a gun followed them and told her sister, who was 12, to take off her clothes once he cornered them. My great-grandmother repeatedly tried to get the gun out of his hands, but also had to hold back so she wouldn't get shot. He forced her to stand back and started wrestling her sister's clothes off. She finally tackled him. He threw her off and pulled the trigger, but nothing happened. When she realized the gun was jammed, she picked up a rock and started to fully attack him. She knocked him over and hit him in the face repeatedly, while her sister kicked him until he stopped moving. They hid in the woods for 2 days until they found their father, who had also survived the shooting. The three of them moved to Hungary a year later. 10 years later, she was the only one in her family to survive the Holocaust, but she never really talked about that. Story 5. Oh man, where do I start? This should come with a trigger warning, so please don't read if you are sensitive or still have any faith in humanity. I once took care of an 18-month-old little boy who had been abused by several men in a crack house. His internal organs were damaged beyond repair. He died several days later. Oh, and his mother had sold him for a couple of hits. There was a young woman ravaged by AIDS and other communicable diseases. Her parents had abandoned her and her siblings when she was 11 years old. She sold herself to a local pimp to make money to support her siblings. She got them all through high school and college. She went missing for a while, but they eventually found her and brought her to the hospital. That was slightly uplifting. There was a woman who had been tied up and burned by her boyfriend. He started at her feet. It took several days before someone smelled burning and called the fire department. She never stopped screaming, no matter how much pain medication we gave her, so we had to sedate her quickly. A young man came in with a swollen arm. Years earlier, he had been a child soldier in Somalia. He had been shot with a shotgun as punishment for trying to stop them from harming his 6-year-old sister. The arm had never been repaired and was causing him constant pain. I also took care of a man who would purposely injure himself by cutting open his stomach, claiming it was accidental. The last time was bad. His intestines were fully exposed, fecal matter was present, and there were wounds everywhere. Spines completely exposed from people left lying in filth, not repositioned. One family left their grandmother home alone for a week while they went on vacation. They left a cooler with food and water next to her chair. By the time they returned, she was completely altered and essentially fused to the chair. EMS had to cut the fabric apart to bring her in. We had to peel the fabric off, and when we did, her skin came off with it. I told the family that if they didn't sit in the room and watch, I would report them. I called the police anyway. Honestly, the cases that hurt the most are ones like a mid-30s single mother of 4 who was diagnosed with aggressive breast cancer. Her copayment to start treatment was $1,400. It took her 9 months to save up the money. By the time she did, the cancer was growing out of her body and spreading everywhere. There was nothing we could do but manage her pain. 4 children lost their mother over $1,400. I deeply resent the American healthcare system. So many more stories come to mind, but I don't want to think about them anymore. Story 6. While my mom was pregnant with me, 1979, she and my father kidnapped my 5-year-old half-sister from her first husband. They took her from Ohio to Texas and were on the run with her for 10 months. During that time, I was born. Her father kept calling my aunt, my mom's sister, begging for information about his daughter's whereabouts. My aunt eventually told him they were in Corpus Christi, Texas. He immediately flew out there. He checked into a cheap motel and called his wife. They prayed together over the phone, and when they finished, he looked out the window of his hotel room. My mother holding newborn me, my father and my sister were walking past his window. They were staying at the same motel. The police were called and my sister was returned to her father. They went to court, and no charges were filed against my mother and father, but they were never allowed to see her again. Courts in the late 70s and early 80s were wild. I knocked on her front door when I was 19 so I could meet her. I knew where she lived because my mother would occasionally drive me past her house to show me where my sister lived. Story 7. My good friend took her life a few years ago after a long battle with mental illness. We were in the Army together. She had been divorced for a while and was sharing custody of her 2 sons pretty amicably with her ex-husband. On the night she took her life, her kids had left with their dad for the weekend just a few hours earlier. It was a Friday night, and they were due back on Sunday. They ended up staying with him for an extra night due to some delays. The dad texted my friend to let her know he'd take them to school on Monday and that they would take the bus home afterward. When they got home, 3 days after she died, her children found her body. They've been traumatized ever since. We still believe she intended for the dad to be the one to find her, not her children, because he always brought them into the house after dropping them off. This has stuck with me for years, and I think about them often. Story 8. My dad and mom both worked at a lumber mill in the Rogue Valley area of Oregon during the 1970s. The mill did a number of things, cutting and planing different types of boards, making trim, etc. They also had an industrial wood chipper for scrap and unusable materials. The chips would go through a chute that shot outside into a chip/sawdust pile. One day, one of the workers assigned to the chipping area had been drinking. While pushing some scrap boards into the chipper, he fell forward and couldn't get out, possibly due to being intoxicated. His front two arms made their way into the chipping blades, and he was pulled in up to his elbows before another worker was able to shut the machine off. My dad was outside at the time and said he and about 20 other workers watched as the chips and sawdust suddenly stopped coming out, and instead blood and small chunks of flesh sprayed out, turning the pile into a soggy red mess. He said the worker ended up bleeding to death before he could reach the hospital. There was a blood stain on the floor in the chipping area that they could never get rid of, no matter what they did. For the remaining 2 to 3 years my dad worked there. I didn't believe this story at first, but my mom later corroborated it, telling me about it from her perspective when he wasn't even around. She had been inside the building when it happened. It sounded like she was relatively close to where it occurred, though not in the exact area. Story 9. Traveling on the slow boat from Thailand into Laos down the Mekong River in early 2020. It was 8 hours of beautiful scenery, party atmosphere, and a good laugh. I met a guy named Chris, an Aussie from Melbourne, who was traveling with an English girl. We stopped off for the night halfway through the journey, all prepaid, and some of us went out to the only bar. He bought some coca, whatever. The following morning, we all got back on the boat for another 8-hour ride to Luang Prabang. The atmosphere was dead. I assumed everyone was just as hungover as I was. We arrived and took a weird truck tuk-tuk style taxi into the town. That's when someone said, "It's a shame what happened to Chris last night." I asked if they meant Chris, the Aussie, and they said yes. He had gotten high, fell asleep on his back, and choked on his vomit during the night. Apparently the girl knocked on his door and couldn't get an answer. The staff had to break the door down, and that's how they found him. She went with his body to the hospital and had to speak to his parents, even though she had only known him for a few days. I spoke to someone who'd been in touch with her, and 10 days later, she flew back to Thailand and then to the UK because she was so emotionally affected. A pretty tragic situation. Don't mix substances and don't sleep on your back, kids. Story 10. This happened in Scotland, where the laws are different from those in England or America. A former girlfriend once told me how she came to move to my town. She had been living with someone who regularly hurt her and assaulted her. He also told her that if she ever reported him, he would stab her. One weekend, he injured her so badly she had to be taken to the hospital. Her injuries were reported to the police. She gave them a statement, and they informed her that he would be charged with assault and battery. However, he followed through on his threat and attacked her again, putting her back in the hospital. When the case came to court, she was terrified and refused to give evidence out of fear for her life. As a result, she was jailed for 7 days for prevarication. The only reason she eventually agreed to testify was the promise of a new life in a different town. So she did 7 days in jail, while the man who hurt her got 12 months of probation. If that isn't a deeply flawed system, I don't know what is. Story 11. My grandpa was forced to kneel in broken glass by Mao supporters in 1949 in southern China, where the Chinese side of my family is from. He was around 8 or 9 at the time. I believe his entire family was targeted because they owned a small plot of land. His father had worked in Canada and sent money back to support the family, which allowed them to acquire the land. His father passed away sometime before 1949. My grandpa was born in 1940, and my grandma in 1941, so they were both born during the Japanese occupation. After that came the Chinese Civil War and the communist takeover. My grandpa's school once took a trip where the students waved at Kim Il-sung. He has reportedly experienced nightmares for over 70 years. But within the Chinese immigrant community, mental health is often viewed as a weakness, so these things are rarely spoken of. I only learned about it through my mom, who is white, because no one on the Chinese side of the family talks about it. With this context, a lot of the intergenerational trauma in my Chinese family makes a lot more sense. Story 12. I had an old co-worker who was in his early 30s at the time. He worked as a stock boy. His wife was about 5 years younger, and they had two small children. When I say this woman was unkempt, it's not an exaggeration. She smelled strongly, like a mix of rotting cheese and peanut butter. Her hair was always greasy, her face covered in acne, and she wore dirty, ripped clothes. When she opened her mouth, her teeth were visibly decaying. Their kids sometimes looked clean and cared for, other times not. It seemed to depend on who had been watching them that day. Occasionally, his mother would take them for a few days to give his wife a break. They weren't wealthy, but they weren't in deep financial trouble either. It seemed more like a matter of mental health or personal neglect. She got pregnant with a third child, and he looked visibly distraught at work every day. She would come in as disheveled as ever, rubbing her big belly with pride. She said, "Sure glad the medication worked this time." One of my co-workers questioned what she meant, and that's when it came out. She had reportedly drugged her own husband because he no longer wanted to be intimate, and she wanted another child. She had attempted to use other substances in the past to coerce him, which hadn't worked. She was upset because those substances had worked before, when she conceived their second child. He eventually divorced her, thankfully. Story 13. I've worked in construction my whole life, but about 10 years ago I met a guy named Sako, pronounced Sako, not sure how it's spelled. He always came across as a gentle and trustworthy person, very quiet and didn't speak much. He was probably in his late 50s or early 60s. I think he was from somewhere around Bosnia, though I could be wrong. It's been a while. One night we had a poker game, and Sako got absolutely hammered, something everyone said he'd never done in the 15 years they'd known him. That night, he opened up. He said that when he was about 7 years old, he woke up in the middle of the night to find his parents unusually joyful, celebrating something. They told him he was going on a vacation with his older brother. Right then, and that's why they were so happy. His brother, around 12 or 13, didn't seem thrilled. He looked somber, but Sako was excited. Their father told them they'd be setting off fireworks as they left to celebrate the fun they'd have. So they left in the middle of the night. About 3 or 4 minutes later, Sako heard what he thought were fireworks. He looked back but didn't see anything. When he asked his brother, he saw him quietly crying as they jogged. Sako didn't understand what was going on at the time and didn't press him. Years later, they had made their way to America. He didn't go into detail about how. Sako was crying as he explained, "I felt so foolish. I kept writing my parents letters and always asked my brother why they never wrote back. He said they were probably too busy. Then I found all my letters in a closet. He showed me newspaper clippings he'd kept about the war. That night, my father had been warned the soldiers were coming. He didn't explain anything. I finally understood. The fireworks. They weren't fireworks. My father, he shot my baby sister, my mother, and then himself. 3 fireworks. He broke down sobbing into his arms on the table. The whole room fell silent. Some of us were holding back tears, others couldn't. When Sako finally calmed down enough, he quietly asked someone for a ride home. As soon as he left, we all stood up and left too. No one cashed out the game. It was just a $20 buy-in, but no one cared. We never spoke about it to each other or to him again. After that night, we all understood he'd been through something unimaginable. That probably explained why he was always so quiet and kind. Story 14. When I arrived in Asia, I stayed at the home of a local man who lived with his wife and daughter. On the first day, I got settled in. By the second day, I felt more comfortable, and we were all sitting down to dinner, having a lovely time, sharing stories, and chatting about life. The next morning, while we were having tea, he told me that every Sunday he travels around the country giving out free Bibles. Curious, I asked him when and why he started doing that. He told me about the day he missed church, the first time in over 10 years. That same day, a Suic bomber entered the church he usually attended, and several of his friends and family members died. I started crying as he told the story. Since that day, he's felt that maybe God was looking out for him or trying to send him a message, that you don't have to be in church every day to be a man of faith. From that moment on, he stopped attending regular services unless it was for weddings, baptisms, or confirmations. Instead, he now travels the country handing out Bibles and spreading what he believes is a higher calling. I was still crying as I hugged him. He had lost two of his closest friends and family members, yet he was still so warm and welcoming. He truly made me feel at home, even though I was on the other side of the world. Story 15. My dad served in Afghanistan. I didn't hear the story from him directly. It came from one of his friends who told it while he was drunk. And as they say, drunks and children tell the truth. My dad was deployed and doing typical military tasks, patrols, convoy operations, etc. Nothing out of the ordinary. After a major firefight, he and his team were regrouping around their vehicles. While most of the guys were taking a break, my dad was assigned to sentry duty, watching the surrounding area. He saw a kid, maybe 14 years old, approach. The boy waved and my dad waved back. The kid then disappeared around a corner. My dad, having a soft spot for children, let his guard down a little. A few moments later, the same boy reappeared, this time with a weapon on his shoulder. He fired an RPG and hit one of the vehicles. No one died, but several soldiers were seriously injured. My dad, realizing what had happened, returned fire. He shot the boy. That was the only story I ever heard about his time over there. Pretty devastating if you ask me. And to make it worse, when he returned home, my mom left him and took everything. Just salt in the wound. Story 16. My dad grew up with a wildly abusive mother and was a stubborn little troublemaker from infancy. She did awful things like forcing him to eat his own vomit and beating him with studded belts. There's a lot I doubt I'll ever fully know. Despite being one of the youngest, he would gather his siblings and try to run away together. She once left him home alone when he was very young, and he decided she wasn't allowed to come back, so he started throwing her things out the windows. Eventually, the family decided to move to Australia for better opportunities, but couldn't afford to move everyone at once. They split the family. My grandmother stayed in their home country with some of the kids, and my grandfather took the rest, planning to earn money and send for the rest later. When they arrived, my grandfather promptly abandoned the children. As an adult, my dad learned that he had moved just a few hours away and started a new family. That was painful. My dad and his siblings grew up in children's homes, basically orphanages, and their mother fought to get them back, but failed. I don't know a lot about that time. My dad tells the lighter stories, how the guardians played dodgeball by kicking balls as hard as they could at the lined-up kids. The time he had art class and they painted the teacher instead. When he lit his desk on fire because someone said he wouldn't dare. Light mentions of beatings. Lots of times he ran away because the streets were better than the home. He stole a car by age 10 and went for a joyride, eventually parking it in a pool. Once, someone tried to gouge his eye out over mistaken identity. His eye is still damaged from that. He was a heavily institutionalized youth offender. The system, if it had ever cared, had already given up on him. If you know much about the backstories of Charles Manson or Albert Fish, it's not far off based on what little I've heard. Since then, the government has formally apologized to former wards of the state, offering compensation and benefits like free dental, because they destroyed the lives of so many children. My dad doesn't have a formal education. He still struggles with things like spelling, but he's incredibly smart, with a practical, logical mind. He hitchhiked around the country a lot, always carrying a knife in his boot. A random couple took him in and looked after him. He came and went as he pleased. The husband of that couple knew Chopper, an infamous figure. You should watch the movie if you haven't. It was a rough crowd. One day when he was about 18, my dad was catching up with his brother. "Where are you living these days?" he asked. "In a share house with a group of girls. You should come over." "A house full of girls? Sounds good to me." While walking up to the house, a girl was walking out. My dad looked at his brother and said, "That's the girl I'm going to marry." The girl in question was a good Catholic girl. After her father died young, the church made sure to put his 5 daughters through school. They were the poor kids at a well-off school. Charity cases, essentially. Sometimes they were sent to children's homes when their mother couldn't afford to feed them. That was actually a good thing. They got plenty of food and always came back home. The girl was fiery, argumentative, and passionate about fairness. In school, she often got in trouble for standing up for others. She would accept the punishment with her head held high because she knew she'd done the right thing. Her sisters would tease her, say she was adopted, and that nobody loved her. Sibling stuff, I guess. Her mother could be both cruel and loving, generous one day, harsh the next. It was disorienting. Her whole family was a little unusual. They called themselves quirky. march to their own drum, just a little different. Nothing wrong with that. But they would eventually learn that their quirks were signs of severe mental illness, and it would lead to many young deaths. At least 2 generations required electroconvulsive therapy, electroshock, and time will tell if that continues. The girl would one day learn the truth about her father, who he really was, and what he had done to his daughters, including her. She couldn't remember it, she was too young when he died, but her older sisters eventually helped her see past the pedestal she had put him on. He was no longer the light of her childhood, taken too soon. That understanding came much later. This girl had grown up on the right side of the law, surrounded by privilege, even if she wasn't part of it. She was used to gallant, clean-cut boys from good families, the kind who brought flowers and shyly asked to hold hands. She wasn't used to boys who tore up school lawns on motorbikes. She wasn't used to scruffy street kids who didn't care about rules. She was not impressed. Instead of flowers, he brought her a potted plant, because flowers just die and a plant made more sense. She told him to get a haircut and a job. He did, and came back to see her again. Obviously, that girl is my mother. Both of my parents came from incredibly difficult backgrounds. They had cycles of abuse to break in a time when that wasn't even acknowledged. We never had much money growing up, and they still don't own a house, but they made sure I always had a roof over my head, food on the table, clean clothes, and access to school. I grew up loved and safe. They never resented me for having what they didn't, because parents are supposed to try to give their children better. A lot of these stories are dark. My parents, especially my dad, walked a fine line, and in slightly different circumstances, they might have ended up down a dark path. I've always found it hard to accept when people use their past as an excuse for bad behavior, because probably due to how I was raised, I've always been drawn to people with painful pasts. And I've known plenty who've experienced worse and still chose to be kind. I experienced domestic violence as a young adult, and my abuser tried that excuse on me. It didn't work. I've heard a lot of dark stories, friends, partners, strangers, but those aren't mine to share. Most of them are still unfolding, and it's not my place. So I wanted to add some hope. Cycles can be broken. Light can be found in dark places. Better can exist, even if it's not perfect. Hurt people isn't good enough. Don't accept that excuse from yourself or others. Some might look down on you for not meeting their definition of success, but that's when you hold your head high and say, forget you. We don't all start from the same place. We just do our best with the hand we were dealt. We try to be better than what came before. Terrible things can and do happen every day, but the good is worth fighting for. Anyway, my parents are cool and I'm proud of them. Story 17. In high school, the woman who lived behind my family's house was left by her husband for a much younger woman. She quickly spiraled into alcoholism and severe anorexia, and she died in the house. She and her 2 dogs were in there for a while before her kids bothered to call a neighbor to check on her. A lot of her was gone by then, but my neighbor specifically mentioned the face. It might not be the most disturbing thing I've ever heard or witnessed, but it happened just a couple 100 yards from my bedroom, and we had no idea. For what I recall was a couple of weeks. We could hear the dogs barking, but that was normal. She'd often pass out and forget to let them out. I'm okay with my cat eating me if I die, and she's too dumb to knock over the bag of food that's next to her bowl. Whoever finds me would probably be significantly less okay with it. Story 18. I've flown helicopters for a few years, and it's taken me to places well off the beaten path. I spent a few years in West Africa, in a diamond mining region known for its barren coastline. I was still fairly new, and I had been told that since we were the only helicopter in the region, I should expect to help out occasionally with rescue missions. The national airline would actually fly lower for extended periods and scan the beaches, then radio in when they spotted anyone. The people they spotted were stowaways on vessels traveling around the Cape. The crew would wait until the ship was off the skeleton coast, then dump them overboard. The water was cold, they couldn't swim, and there were sharks. My first call was to rescue a group of 4. I won't go into too much detail, but recovering them was difficult. They ran at the helicopter in desperation. They were children, maybe 10 or 11 years old. They spoke Portuguese and explained that there were originally 11 of them. The captain had thrown them overboard with a few oil drums, and they had been picked off one by shadows in the water. After we rescued them, government officials took them away. I heard they were medically checked, then sent to an adult prison near our base, and would be deported back to their country. It's something I think about a lot. Story 19. A close friend's mother used to work at the hospital in our town, and about 23 years ago, a man came in. A terrible person. A killer and an alleged child abuser. He was having seizures, so he was transferred from jail to the hospital. The doctors told him he wasn't going to survive the night. They brought in a priest and asked if he wanted to repent, but he spat on the priest and said horrible things about God, insisting he wanted to go to hell. Not long after, he passed away. My friend's mom and another nurse had to run post-mortem checks to confirm he was gone. Heart, blood pressure, lungs, everything showed he was dead. After the second nurse left, the man sat up and began screaming that it burned and that he wanted to go home. Then he dropped back down, dead again. The second nurse said she heard the screaming, but didn't see him sit up. My friend's mom said that experience changed her life, and from that day on, she's never missed a single day of church. Story 20. I used to volunteer at a center that helped recent immigrants to the U.S. with things like English lessons and basic introductions to living in a new country. One of the highlights was the end of the semester when volunteers would receive a booklet of selected essays from the English class. Some stories were mildly disturbing, but one really stayed with me. It was written by a Liberian who had been living in Côte d'Ivoire, Ivory Coast, before making it to the U.S. He described how the locals hated Liberians, believing they were bringing their civil war across the border. He had to pretend to be Ivorian just to avoid being kicked out, or worse. The part that hit me the hardest was when he described an attack on a village where he and his cousin were staying. He didn't know whether the attackers were government or rebel troops. Both sides were known to raid villages without warning. He and his cousin ran side by side trying to escape. Then his cousin was hit and fell. He couldn't stop to help without risking his own life, so he kept running. That was the last time he ever saw him. He made it to the U.S. and was taking prep courses for nursing school when he wrote that essay. Every time I think about it, I wonder about the guilt he must carry. He made it to safety and a promising future. His cousin, dead or captured, was left behind. If that bullet had been a few inches to the left or right, it might have been him instead. The weight of surviving while someone you love doesn't. That's what really stayed with me. Story 21. From a friend who is a truck driver, an elderly man was celebrating his 89th birthday with family and friends at a Denny's restaurant. After most of the group had left, it was just the man and his wife or daughter, the staff, and my friend sitting at a nearby table. As my friend walked past him on the way to the bathroom, he said, "Happy birthday, young'un," just being friendly. When he returned, a waitress was removing the old man's plate, and the man leaned over and said something like, "You don't get to be my age without some regrets." He went on to share that he had been a firefighter back when things weren't like they are now. He motioned toward the waitress, who was black, and began explaining that during his time as a firefighter, things were very different in his city. He admitted that he and others at his station would pretend to respond to fires in black neighborhoods, but wouldn't actually put them out. He described how they'd act like equipment wasn't working or that they couldn't hear people trapped inside. He claimed that sometimes they'd watch homes burn or even keep score among themselves. The last time he participated in something like that, he said he saw a child, a baby, trapped in a crib. The baby locked eyes with him, stopped screaming, and just stared as the fire consumed everything. He said he's been haunted by that memory every night for the last 50 years. According to him, nobody questioned these actions at the time. My friend was stunned. The man kept repeating that things were just different back then, as if it somehow excused it. His wife or daughter sat silently. My friend said it made him wonder how many others like him, who were never held accountable, are still out there. If former war criminals can be found decades later, why not those who committed atrocities at home? Story 22. I was in a freshman year history class. The teacher, who had been a student at the same high school in the 1970s and a teacher since the 1980s, was well known, kind of strict, but respected and funny. One day he started telling us stories about a childhood friend he had in elementary and middle school. We laughed along with the mischief they got into. Then suddenly he said, "Yeah, I wish I could still tell him these stories, but he's dead." The room went silent. He told us that on Easter, his friend had been shot and killed, along with his entire family. Apparently, the friend's uncle lived with them and frequently shot cans in the backyard. But on that Easter Sunday, the uncle had a mental breakdown. He shot the child's mom, dad, grandma, and all his siblings, ranging from teenagers to toddlers, and then shot the child himself. During the investigation, it was determined the uncle shot the adults first, then the older kids, working his way down to the youngest. Afterward, he sat on the couch, surrounded by their bodies, drank a beer, and then called the police. My teacher said that on the way to Easter dinner that day, he passed by the house and saw the uncle sitting on the couch. He even said something like, "I wonder what my friend is doing today." He was stunned when, during the trial, the uncle recounted sitting on that couch exactly as he had seen him. The class sat in silence until the bell rang. Then we all awkwardly stood up and left without a word. Story 23. Not something I heard, something that happened to me when I was about 10. I'm a woman now. That was the year I first learned what explicit material was, and after telling one of my friends, she suggested we watch it together. We never did anything beyond watching it, but I quickly became addicted. That same friend convinced me to try other things too, like going on a Omegle to watch random adult men doing inappropriate things, then mock them. At some point, I downloaded an app. I can't remember if it was a dating app or something else, but I started talking to a guy who was around 23. Within our first few texts, he sent me a video. It showed a very young girl, maybe a year old, possibly wearing a shirt but no pants. A man appeared on the screen and did something unimaginable. At first, the baby didn't react. Then she cried. I think that's where the video ended, or at least that's all I can remember. My friend encouraged me to keep talking to the man, and I did. She even convinced me to share that video with people who were younger than me. I still don't understand how I didn't get caught doing that. I later asked the man if he had made the video. He claimed someone else had sent it to him. I don't know if that was true. My friend then had me lie about my age and say I was 16. She also made sure the man knew I was a girl. He told me his dream was to harm children, and he asked me to help him. My friend encouraged me to agree. Thankfully, my mom went through my phone around that time and found everything, the messages, the video, and the app. She deleted everything and took my phone. I'm beyond thankful that she did. I have no idea what might have happened had that gone on longer. I cut off that friend about a year and a half later. Story 24. My kid's father and his brother were working together, digging trenches for water and sewer lines before new houses were built. There was another set of brothers, one digging alongside them, the other operating a backhoe. The man digging had gone ahead of the crew into a section of trench where wall supports hadn't been installed yet. It had rained that week. The trench walls collapsed, burying him completely. Everyone panicked and started digging with shovels. His brother, desperate to help, brought the backhoe over to speed things up. Tragically, while trying to dig him out, he accidentally struck and decapitated him. But from what they could tell, the man had likely already died from the pressure of the collapse. Still, it was awful. Everyone was sent home early, and OSHA was brought in. My partner and his brother came home looking sick and shaken. They were just feet away from the whole thing and were the first to try and dig him out. It was terrible. I never heard anything more about the surviving brother. Story 25. When I was a teenager, I was very careless about who I spent time with and what I was doing. One night, I was with a friend, drinking outside when some men approached us. I recognized one of them as someone I had spoken to on Instagram but never met in person. He offered to buy another bottle, and me being foolish and borderline dependent on alcohol, agreed. My friend went home because she wasn't dumb, and I went with the guys. I remember the guy I knew from Instagram bought apple-flavored vodka, which I never did well with for some reason. We went back to his hostel, his friends left, and we were drinking there. Next thing I knew, I blacked out. Something that happened often because of how much I drank. I woke up the next morning in his bed with my underwear on the floor, so I did the walk of shame out of the building and went home. Much later, I was diagnosed with an STI that I had caught from him. Even worse, I found out he was dating an old friend of mine who I had recently reconnected with. After me and him had already done what we did, he had infected both of us. The moral of the story, don't be reckless like I was. If you absolutely must drink, do it around people you trust with your life. Story 26. I didn't just hear this. I witnessed it. I'm 17 years old and I work at a restaurant near the beach. It was a slow day, and one of my coworkers, we'll call him Rick, saw an older woman who looked homeless approaching the restaurant with a very worn-down shopping cart. There was a table outside with a couple just trying to enjoy their meal, and this lady turned to face the street with her backside toward the diners and just dropped her pants completely, exposing herself to the couple. The manager, Rick, and I were standing out front and saw it happen. Luckily, I didn't see it directly because a brick pillar happened to block my view, but the manager saw everything and immediately ran over. When he confronted her, she cut him off and shouted, "Call the cops!" before pulling her pants back up and running away. The couple at the table, they wrote on their receipt, "Thanks for the free entertainment." They definitely passed the vibe check. Story 27. Someone I know was 5 years old sitting on the couch watching Sesame Street with their mom. Their dad walked into the room and struck their mom in the head with an axe, splitting her head open. He then turned around, left the room, walked upstairs into a bedroom, and locked the door. The 5-year-old was the one who called 911. There was a 2-hour standoff between the police and the father outside the bedroom door. Afterward, the mother's parents took the child in. The father's parents, however, began taking the child's family to court at every opportunity to gain custody. During their teen years, the father's family would even show up at the house and yell from the street, accusing them of being a terrible child for not visiting their father in prison or asking the court to let the paternal grandparents raise them. The father was sentenced to 30 years but was granted parole after 20. Since then, he has sent birthday cards every year, as if nothing had ever happened. Even in a case where someone could argue momentary insanity, it's hard to imagine expecting a child to simply move on from watching one parent murder the other. But it wasn't a moment of rage. During police interviews, the father said he had planned to kill his wife, his child, and then himself, but couldn't follow through on the last two. In his parole plea, he said he regretted putting his child through that situation, but expressed no remorse for the act itself. After his release, he married a woman in her 20s who had a child from a previous relationship. He even includes pictures of his new wife and child in the birthday cards. His new wife is roughly the same age as the person I know. My friend has had years of therapy, but one thing they say they'll never fully move past is how their father was able to recreate the life they should have had growing up. Every card is a painful reminder that their dad was perfectly capable of being a normal parent, and also perfectly capable of killing someone with an axe, less than 2 feet away from their child. Saying my friend has trust issues is an understatement. Story 28. My old coworker once told me what is now referred to as the dog story. I haven't shared it with many people because when it was first told to me, one of the listeners went to the bathroom and threw up. Usually, once I explain that it involves dogs, most people don't want to hear the rest. This co-worker's dad traveled for work internationally. He was sent by his company to South Korea. When he arrived, he met up with a company representative he had previously met in the UK. They got along well, and the rep invited him out to dinner, promising to show him the best restaurant in town. They went a few side streets away from the main road to a small, unassuming place. No flashy signs, but a line out front. The rep said not to worry, he had a reservation. After a short wait, they were brought inside. The restaurant was plainly furnished, with a few pictures on the walls. But the most noticeable thing was the concrete floor. There were no carpets, just a bare surface with slight tapers toward small grills embedded in the floor. The tables and chairs were also simple and functional. Sensing confusion, the rep told him the place might not look like much, but it had the best food in town, which explained why it was packed. Menus were brought, but the co-worker's dad couldn't read Korean well, so he let the rep choose for him. The rep happily placed the order in Korean. Soon a staff member arrived, dragging over a cart with a grill. He lit it, then left. A few minutes later he returned, this time holding a live dog by the collar. My co-worker said her dad described it as medium-sized, like a large spaniel. At first he was confused. Why was the dog there? Then without warning, the staff member pulled out a long curved hook and in one swift motion, plunged it into the side of the dog's neck. Blood poured out, draining into the floor grill. Her dad realized the floor's design was for exactly this purpose. The dog was pinned to the cart, still alive and looking up at him. The staff member then pulled out a long knife and quickly sliced off the dog's tail, immediately placing it on the grill. Within moments, he presented the grilled tail to my coworker's dad to eat, while the dog continued to bleed out and stare at him. According to my coworker, her father jumped up, ran out of the restaurant, vomited all over the street, and rushed back to his hotel. I have no proof of this story's truth, and I honestly hope it's not real. That would be nice. But the assignment was to share stories we've heard, and that's what I was told. Story 29. When I was in high school, I used to watch TV dramas based on real-life stories. One episode told the story of a woman who grew up in an orphanage and later became a S-worker. One day she met a client who treated her with unexpected kindness, and they eventually fell in love. They planned to get married. But one day she saw a photo of his mother, wearing a necklace that looked exactly like hers. It was the only item she had from her biological mother. After some investigation, she discovered the truth. The man she was about to marry was her biological brother. She immediately ended the engagement and cut off the relationship. A year later, she met another regular client, a married man with 2 children. He promised her that once his marriage was annulled, he would marry her. Eventually, his annulment was finalized, and they did get married. A year later, they had a child together. One day, after being intimate, she was picking up their clothes when his wallet fell to the floor. She picked it up and found a photo inside. It was a picture of her biological mother. She was shocked. She knew it wasn't his ex-wife. She had seen the woman at the annulment hearings. She realized that the woman in the photo was his first wife, her biological mother. In the end, she discovered she had unknowingly married and had a child with her biological father. Story 30. A story a colleague told me. A friend of his went on a trip to Poland and went clubbing. She kissed a guy and almost went home with him, but her friends convinced her to return to the hotel with them, since they had an early departure the next morning. Over the next couple of days, she developed a strange rash that wouldn't go away. She had it checked at a doctor's office, and they called her back in for the results. That was unusual since they normally just give the diagnosis over the phone and prescribe treatment. When she arrived, the doctor asked what she had been up to lately. They told her the rash was caused by a type of bacteria typically found on corpses in advanced stages of decomposition. It was traced back to the guy she had kissed in Poland, who was likely involved in something very disturbing. I'm not sure if they ever discovered exactly what was going on, but this story never fails to make me feel sick. Story 31. This pales in comparison to some other stories, but in 2014, a family from my town, all people we would regularly see at the local supermarket, died within a year of each other. They had a 10-year-old son with multiple disabilities, including a seizure condition. He passed away in his sleep and was found by his mother. The family was Indian, and in their cultural or religious practices, as I understand it, though this is a simplification, if a child dies before the father must give the final blessing before burial. The father was away on a business trip, and instead of calling him, the mother placed her son's body in the bathtub with bags of ice until the father could return. Authorities were alerted, possibly because the boy hadn't shown up to school, and discovered the body before the father came back. The mother was initially charged, but she was eventually cleared, and the boy's death was ruled natural. Still, the rumors never stopped. Everyone in the neighborhood continued to believe she had killed him. A few months later, both parents were found dead in the home. The father had narcotics in his system and pill bottles around him. The mother was found drowned in the pool. His death was ruled a murder and hers a suicide. Many of us believe she took both their lives out of guilt, shame, or simply because she couldn't cope with the weight of the rumors, despite likely not doing anything wrong in the first place. Story 32. When I was at university, there was a house where 5 of the rugby players lived together. People called it the House of Pain because of all the alcohol they drank and the outrageous things they did, drinking questionable substances, crude pranks, and worse. One day, one of the guys lost a bet with another. The loser had to make a curry for the winner. So he did, using dog food as the meat. The winner vowed to get revenge. When the loser went home for the weekend and returned with a bunch of food his mom had packed for him, including a cooked chicken, the other guy saw his opportunity. He took the chicken from the fridge, placed it on the end of his genitals, and walked out to show it off to the others. But it didn't stop there. The rest of them took turns going into a downstairs bedroom to perform a vulgar act into a cup. They then poured the contents all over the chicken. After the guy ate it, they told him what they had done. Shockingly, even the victim treated it as a joke, and they all laughed it off as banter. Story 33. I've got one that could easily be on a show like Maury or Jerry Springer. I went on a date with a woman who works as a state prosecutor in a major southern U.S. city. Her job involves going after people who are behind on court-ordered child support. She told me about a case involving two teenage couples who went on a double date. They ended up in a car, and since they didn't have a place to go, they decided to take turns using the back seat for intimacy. The issue? Only one condom. Couple A went first while couple B waited in the front seat. Afterward, Guy A removed the condom, turned it inside out, rinsed it with leftover Dr. Pepper from the car, and handed it to Guy B. Couple B then used it. A month later, girl B found out she was pregnant. Guy B denied being the father. A paternity test proved he wasn't. But then they tested Guy A, and he was the father. The remnants in the improperly cleaned, reused condom had caused the pregnancy. He was ultimately found liable for child support. Story 34. Even though I'm still a teenager, there's one story I've heard that stuck with me. My school is extremely strict. No makeup, no non-uniform clothing, no different colored pants or skirts allowed. They also regularly check our backpacks. We're not even allowed in our classrooms during breaks or lunchtime, and there are cameras in both the bathrooms and changing rooms, so any staff member can monitor us at any time. The strange thing is, despite all this, one couple still managed to cross a line. They would sneak off into the bushes in the schoolyard, thinking nobody could see them. But as expected, they were caught almost immediately by school security. Apparently, this wasn't even the first time. It was a regular thing for them. Eventually, the girl's own friends told everything to the principal because she had shared all the details with them. This story highlights the inequality in how these situations are handled. The girl ended up traumatized. Her parents were furious with her. She stopped attending school, and rumors spread everywhere. Her life became completely miserable. The boy, on the other hand, I know him personally. Nothing happened to him. He went on living his life like normal. No backlash at all. No one even said a word to him. Right now, the girl has returned to school, and I'm trying to support her the best I can. She told me that he pressured her into everything, and I truly believe she was manipulated. It's clear she didn't deserve any of the blame. Story 35. This was a horror story I heard around a campfire at a kid's summer camp. It went something like this. A girl's parents left her home alone one night. She turned on the news and saw a report about a dangerous inmate who had escaped from a prison just a few miles away. The report warned everyone to lock their doors. Suddenly, the power went out. She grabbed a flashlight and went to her room, where she started reading with her dog by her side. Later in the night, she let her dog out into the backyard and unlocked the doggy door so he could come back in when he was ready. At one point, she heard a strange noise outside but assumed her dog had just caught a squirrel. Soon, she heard the dog come back in through the doggy door and called for him. He came to her and licked her hand, then walked away. This happened several times. She called his name, he came and licked her hand, and then left again. Eventually, she called one more time, and he didn't come. Thinking he was just asleep, she got up to use the bathroom. In the bathroom, written in blood on the mirror, were the words, "People can lick too." Her dog's body was lying on the floor. Story 36. The story starts when she was just a girl, and he was already making her life miserable. She disliked him from the beginning. He stalked her, watching when she left the house, showing up uninvited. Whenever she tried to tell him to leave her alone, she'd get in trouble both at home and at school. Still, he never stopped. He kept saying she was the love of his life, even though she made it clear she didn't feel the same. This continued for about 20 years. She moved constantly to avoid him. At one point, she had a child with someone else, and somehow he even managed to sneak into the delivery room, wearing a mask, making it less obvious to everyone else. Anytime she tried to explain the truth, she was told she was overreacting or crazy. People kept saying she should be grateful. He does these things because he loves you. Before the pandemic, she finally built up the courage to return to her hometown. He was waiting, with his coworkers and friends. He started harassing her again, and at one point even proposed to her. She snapped, unable to believe that after 20 years of misery, people still expected her to say yes. Instead of supporting her, people said she should feel sorry for him. He would constantly show up to help, when in reality, he was making her life worse. He caused her to lose everything. It got so bad that she had a breakdown and had to be admitted to a psychiatric ward. Even then, he sent friends to check on her. When she told the psychologist about it, they considered transferring her to a more restricted unit, and she feared losing custody of her daughter. To this day, she still deals with the consequences. She hates him with everything she has, but it feels inevitable that he'll appear again, masked behind his twisted version of love. He said he just wanted her to remember him, but never cared how she would. The worst part? He ruined every opportunity she had, burned every bridge she tried to cross. He even managed to cause so much damage that her family couldn't find work in town and had to move away. And no, it wasn't even his hometown. He destroyed it all and still doesn't understand why she hates him. Story 37. This happened to my cousin's girlfriend around 2010, and it still messes with me whenever I think about it. She was in her early 20s, living in a mid-sized town in the Midwest, working part-time at a supermarket and taking community college classes. One night after work, she was waiting for her bus when a man approached her. He was maybe in his 40s, scruffy but not homeless looking, and asked if she could help him call a cab. She didn't have a phone on her, but she offered to walk with him to the gas station nearby so he could use theirs. He seemed nervous, kept looking over his shoulder, but didn't act aggressive or anything. On the way, he started talking, fast, rambling. He said he had just gotten out of the hospital, that he was trying to find his brother, that he didn't have any money but just needed a ride out of town. She started getting uncomfortable, and when they reached the gas station, she told him she had to go. He didn't follow her inside, and she thought that was the end of it. The next day, she saw his face on the news. His name was Darren R. something. He had escaped from a psychiatric hospital 2 towns over by hiding in a laundry cart. He wasn't just any patient. He was being held after being found incompetent to stand trial. He'd been arrested 2 years earlier after police responded to a noise complaint at his house and found what they described as a makeshift morgue in his basement. Darren had apparently been luring men to his home using Craigslist ads, offering money for modeling gigs or casual hookups. Once there, he drugged them, killed them, and preserved parts of their bodies. When they finally caught him, they found 4 bodies and a collection of items in jars. He told the police he was trying to rebuild his dead brother. And the worst part? He escaped just 2 hours before she met him. He had made it nearly 40 miles on foot, probably hitching rides or hiding in delivery trucks, and she had walked alone with him for several blocks. When she talked to detectives later, they told her that it was almost certain he was looking for a new victim. He had nothing on him, no money, no ID, but he had already taken a belt from a department store bathroom, which they believed he intended to use as a ligature. She had noticed it hanging from his hand, but thought it was his. They found him 2 days later. He had broken into a vacation home and was trying to steal a car when the owner came home early and called the police. He was arrested without a fight. She still thinks about what would have happened if she hadn't insisted on going into the gas station, or if she had agreed to give him money, or, God forbid, if she had taken him somewhere in her car. It's been over a decade now, and she says she still can't be around men with that same rough, patchy beard or that kind of distant, vacant stare. She never rides buses alone anymore either, and I honestly don't blame her. Story 38. I used to work in hospice care. One of my patients was an elderly man in his late 80s who was dying of lung cancer. He didn't have much family left, except one adult son who lived in another state. They weren't very close, but the son would call occasionally to check in. Mostly he was just interested in the will. The old man told me during one of our late-night chats that he had decided to leave his modest estate to his nurse, me, because I was the only person who treated him like a human being in his final months. I tried to talk him out of it, honestly, but he insisted. A week later, he died peacefully. Here's where it gets insane. The son flew in for the funeral and learned he wasn't in the will. He lost it. The guy broke into the funeral home during the night, dragged his father's embalmed body out of the casket, and tried to burn it in the parking lot. Apparently, he thought if the body wasn't preserved, the will would be invalidated somehow. Completely unhinged. He was arrested, of course. I testified during the trial. The guy got a short sentence for desecration and attempted arson. But I'll never forget the image of that man, in a nice suit, calmly sitting in court while they showed surveillance footage of him dragging his father's corpse across the floor like it was a trash bag. Absolutely messed up.